I'm Dr. Carrie Horn, and you are listening to an excerpt from my book, A Soul Aligned: How God Heals His Creations. My story. When God told me to write a book, I was dying. No doubt I was already spiritually dead, but my body was slowly and painfully dying. I was unable to eat any food except for beef without breaking out into welts and blisters, experiencing excruciating physical and digestive pain, and flu-like symptoms for at least 3 days in bed. No doctor could tell me what was happening inside of my body, but they never hesitated to prescribe a medication and/or a procedure before I left their office. I had been in psychotherapy for over 20 years and was consistently receiving medical treatment for 7 straight years. For at least the last 2 years, I took thousands of dollars worth of medication and supplements per month and was receiving intravenous supplementation since I could not physically eat. I saw every type of specialist you can imagine, venturing from Western methods to Eastern methods, naturopathy to homeopathy. Over this 7-year period, I progressively got worse, never better. My symptoms began after a series of traumatic experiences and stressful life changes. My father killed himself, and a week after that, our home caught on fire, leaving my family displaced and grieving. Our dog had been killed in the fire, and none of my 17-year-old daughter's belongings were salvageable. 2 months later, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, and she passed within 2 years. I was also launching my career and my daughter to college. The amount of stress and grief inside of me was surreal, and it was difficult to know how to process all that was happening. All I could feel was total overwhelm and shock, and all I could do was oscillate between freezing, numbing, and pushing forward to survive. I began experiencing a series of flus from which I had difficulty recovering. I was placed on several medications and ended up with C. diff as a result. My health rapidly declined, and I began experiencing debilitating and chronic respiratory and digestive issues that would not resolve. My energy was sapped. I knew that I had to deal with the grief inside of me, and I had begun seeing a therapist 3 times per week for psychoanalysis. Oblivious and insensitive to the obvious painful circumstances in my life, she incompetently suggested that I was making myself sick. Incidentally, this therapist, once an academic mentor, had unethically solicited services during the greatest crises of my life because she needed a consistent case project for her second doctorate in psychoanalysis, a pursuit that fundamentally acknowledges that psychologists are seeking more than the field of mental health is currently offering with 1 doctorate. Although I was actively engaged in therapy 3 days per week, my symptoms increased and I was in more distress than ever. I was constantly being stuffed into a template that did not fit and then blamed for not fitting. As a result, I instinctively sought other ways to relieve my pain, which accelerated my decline. I began drinking more alcohol and became fixated on a relationship with an emotionally abusive man in order to avoid the pain of my mother dying. Though that may not sound adaptive, when one is overwhelmed with intolerable pain, distracting with other salient pain in order to avoid the greater pain is most definitely adaptive, particularly when the systems that are supposed to heal are failing to provide even minimal relief. When true healing is not an option, distraction becomes the treatment. By this time, psychology certainly would have condemned me to a personality disorder, which would say nothing about who I was, what I had endured, and how I needed to heal. In fact, healing was unlikely for someone like me. I will not get too far into my trauma history, but I will describe what is necessary in order to understand a picture of what I was dealing with in my life thus far. I grew up in an insidiously abusive home in which I was forced to lie in court as a child and to turn against my mother to a father who exploited, manipulated, abused, and feigned love for me in order to use me. I was forced to hate my mother and was absolutely not allowed to feel any tenderness toward her whatsoever. In essence, my childhood dependence and my love for my daddy were used to eviscerate and destroy my mother through me. My father made his resentments my responsibility to hold for him, and he told me that it was the righteous thing to do to reject my evil mother and to choose him because we were a family and she was the destroyer of our family. I was later told by his sister that he used to beat her so badly you could hear the beatings from outside of the house. In his eyes, she was the one who was against God, and she deserved to be punished and destroyed. As a young child, I believed him, and I certainly could not reject what was righteous to God. I rejected the only parent I had who might have had the capacity to love me for a brutal and indifferent father who had no true interest in loving me. When he was done using me to destroy my mother, whatever love he had been feigning was also done. I was left betrayed, confused, and always trying to get back to a time when Daddy loved me and made promises that he would one day keep. I clung to every bone he threw me as hope that this was the time he would fulfill his promises, only for him to blame me for the reasons why he could not keep his promises to me because I was bad. I was brainwashed and beaten in a room and forced to repeat everything my father told me to think and speak until I got it right. I did not even exist within the protected space of my own mind. The beatings and brainwashing episodes occurred every time that I returned from my mother's home, and especially when custody court dates were approaching or the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, were visiting his home due to anonymous abuse reports that had been filed. The welfare reports had likely been submitted by our neighbors who saw that we were malnourished and mistreated, and they brought portions of food to us in the early morning when we were walking my father's show dogs. My siblings and I were pit against each other in order to compete for Daddy's love. In truth, he always needed a scapegoat, and as the oldest, that most often defaulted to me. Eventually, this alienated my siblings and I from each other. Rather than being a support to one another, we were forced to hate and compete with each other in order to survive and dodge being the scapegoat of the day. We lived in terror every second of our lives. We were isolated and alienated from others as well, rarely visiting a friend or a family member's home. Every move we made was controlled and dictated. We were starved and sleep deprived. We often stood in the corner for hours, sometimes up to a full day without eating, and rare breaks to use the restroom. This was often the case for several days if my father was angry. We rarely played, but were kept busy doing some sort of labor, typically in the yard, and often until early hours of the morning under a spotlight. My father would often force us to stay up and listen to him talk about the Book of Mormon until the wee hours of the morning while he was high on speed. If we fell asleep, he would force us to walk around the room while waving our hands in the air to stay awake. Though there is much more that can be said regarding my childhood, I am going to share only what is necessary for you to gain a piece of the picture so that you can understand the struggles and sin that resulted in me as a result of my unresolved suffering. Unresolved because the systems set in place to treat the wounded people dress those wounds as though they are not serious. Jeremiah 6:14. Even though this horrific and terrorizing childhood was not my fault, it resulted in sin that is mine for which to seek healing. Isn't that something? Yet God knows every hair on my head and every single experience of suffering I have endured, and he has intended it to build me for his purpose. Yes, that stinks if I lean on my own understanding, yet that feeling I had of never belonging here on earth has actually proven to be a blessing. It has made it easy to circumcise from the world once I truly knew Christ. The issue of not having had anyone on whom to depend or rely proved to be a blessing that caused me to know in whom I must rely. Healing from the torment and anguish of living through satanic attack has built in me compassion and understanding for the ministry that God has intended through me. And he has wiped away every tear as I have shared in the perfect joy of the Lord while bringing others to true healing in Christ. Through the years of medical and psychological treatment that amounted to nothing but getting worse, God did not allow any treatment method of the world to give me what only he can give, so that I could learn to rest in and rely on him in order to be saved, not only from satanic attack in this life, but saved for my eternal life in him. God does not give his glory to idols, Isaiah 42:8. We must seek him alone if we are to truly heal, for he has said, I am the Lord who heals you. Exodus 15:26. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. Isaiah 42:8. Now I will tell you what my unresolved suffering or trauma resulted in. Psycho-emotional, spiritual manifestations. So chronic fear and terror, overwhelming grief, depression, PTSD, personality issues, emotional dependence on abusive men, over-drinking and numbing, exploiting myself for false love, uncontrolled anger, perfectionism and constant need for control, dominating others. These are the physical manifestations: inability to eat, starvation, severe exhaustion, muscle atrophy, muscle aches, abdominal distension, severe physical illness, cortisol surges and dips throughout the day, multiple ovarian cyst ruptures, histamine intolerance, intolerance to all foods except for beef, welts that blistered on day 2 for 2 weeks, rashes and hives, extreme lethargy and flu-like aching in my bones and main arteries, insomnia, chronic abdominal pain, chronic cough, vomiting, large bruising without external injury, inflammation, hair loss, thyroid nodules, lymphatic swelling, bacterial overgrowth in my small intestine. This list of symptoms really does not begin to describe the nightmare that I was living or the nightmare others lived around me. My daughter and I had already begun grieving our separation regarding my impending death. My will was in place by the time I was 40 years old. As you review this list of symptoms, you can see that I would have been diagnosed with not 1 or 2, but a number of psychological and medical disorders. And in some cases, I was treated accordingly, and not a single treatment made me better, but only worse. Furthermore, not one symptom had to do with the other. They were all over the place, but they did seem to exacerbate the others. For example, even the slightest amount of stress would cause tingling in my skin and I knew that I was going to break out in welts, which would then turn to blisters from head to toe for 2 weeks. This would increase my cortisol production, my insomnia, and exacerbate my chronic cough and physical pain. My childhood was not my fault, but the onus for seeking healing is on me. I had not been unaccountable for seeking healing. I had been deceived by the world regarding from where healing comes. To put it plainly, though I sought healing for over 20 plus years and I worked diligently in treatment, there was no option for true healing, not in mental health, medicine, science, 12 steps, or churches. I sought various modalities of therapy, including Christian therapy, churches, 12 steps, and self-help. I pursued my own doctorate in psychology, even diligently searching and reading beyond the required curriculum because I was not even receiving the answers that I needed to heal my own pain. How then could I possibly help others with what was so insufficient to help me? I ignorantly engaged in pagan and occult methods as well, without understanding what pagan or occult even meant. As a result of the way that I grew up, I had no compass, no identity, no understanding, and no family from whom to learn. I felt lost and was always fighting to be normal. This left me vulnerable to looking to the world and man to tell me who I should be. I even did a good job of becoming conformed to the world's standards by building 3 businesses, buying a home, and achieving a doctorate, all as a single mother. I had a lot of self-will to be a doer, but doing availed me nothing. Even when I achieved, the satisfaction was short-lived. I was still without healing or understanding. I had no way of dealing with the pain that I felt, and the childhood experiences that I had endured were not common, or at least not commonly spoken about. I felt utterly alone, always trying to rise above and seek a way to heal with little to no relief. As an adolescent, I had been judged and alienated by many of the religious people I grew up with because they were looking at the sin that had resulted from my trauma. I was labeled a bad kid. I knew the condemning attitudes of the field of mental health regarding people like me who had grown up with severe abuse. They typically dismiss and pathologize people who need help dealing with their feelings for not being able to deal with their feelings. Yet they fail to provide a viable way to actually deal with the feelings for the reason our Creator gave them to us. A field that reduces people to evolved beings cannot possibly comprehend the truth of how or why the Creator designed a soul or how He has designed His creations to heal. Rather, scientific disciplines instruct us to think pain away with our carnal brains, and if we can't do that, we're a lost cause. So I did the best I knew how. I looked to the world and I tried to understand what I must do in order to finally overcome my past and be like them. I joined the world in drinking and revelry, distracting myself from my feelings. The sin was adultery and prostitution to the world. I emotionally depended on and sought men to fix my daddy issues, placing men before God. My sin was idolatry. I tried to control and dominate situations and people so I did not have to feel afraid. My sin was self-idolatry. I used substances and distractions in order to numb and avoid the way that I felt inside. My sin, breaking down the temple, idolatry. I experienced uncontrolled anger and rage. My sin, hurting others, self-centeredness, and repetition of trauma. The biggest sin I committed was in spurning God, and I know now that I was experiencing God's judgment and discipline regarding my sin, so that I might finally be brought into submission to Him. Ended relationship after ended relationship, God would confront me about my idolatry, telling me that I had to put Him before any person, place, or thing. I would hear Him, but I could never quite fulfill this obligation to Him because I was gripped by fear and satanic compulsion. I did the very things I did not want to do. Romans 7:15. Fear gripped every part of my life, not a disorder, but fear. And God tells us that fear is a spirit. 2 Timothy 1:7. Every symptom and syndrome I have listed above came right down to that tormenting spirit of fear, wreaking havoc on my mind, body, spirit, and heart. I did not have a physical or psychological problem. My problem was spiritual, and every problem in our lives is spiritual. From the time I was born to my earthly father until the time that my heavenly Father drew me to Christ, I was being spiritually attacked by this sucker-punching and ruthless devil. He didn't care that I was a child. He didn't care that I was a little girl. He waited for me to come from my mother's womb to devour me and steal the purpose for which God has set me apart. The Almighty had other plans. He has been building His lampstand in me through my experiences and His healing of me, so that one day He would light His lampstand in me to shine this very testimony with you regarding how God healed me and how He heals His creations. If you have enjoyed this reading, please like, subscribe, and comment below. Don't forget to ring the bell icon for more videos like this. Thank you for listening, and God bless.